welcome to Meeple University's How to Play Cacao. Cacao is a tile placement game, and in the game players will be placing these tiles, representing their workers, throughout the jungle to gain access to the various action spaces. Through the game, players can buy and sell cacao fruits, go gold mining, gain access to water, and worship at various temples. The game ends when all players have placed all of their worker tiles, and the player with the most gold at the end of the game is the winner. To set up the game, each player takes the circular player board in his or her colour and the corresponding meeple, which is placed on the -10 space of the water track. Next, the player takes the 11 worker tiles in his or her colour. Each worker tile has 4 meeple icons shown on the borders, but the tiles are distinguished by the way those are laid out. In a 3-player game, take one of these tiles and return it to the box, and in a 4-player game, also take one of these tiles and return it to the box. Then, gather up the remaining tiles, shuffle them in a face-down stack, and draw a starting hand of 3 tiles. The player will be able to look at these and will be playing them through the game. Then take the 28 jungle tiles, sort through them to find a single plantation tile and a 2 gold market space, and set them in the middle of the table in this configuration. If you're playing a 2-player game, you'll need to remove 7 specific tiles from the deck: a temple, a sun temple, a water, a number 1 gold mine, a number 3 market, and 2 single plantations. The rulebook has that list. Then gather up the remaining tiles and shuffle them. Place the jungle stack off to the side of the board, draw the top 2 tiles face up and place them next to the stack. This is the display of jungle tiles which are available for the first round of the game. Before I go through the exact mechanics of a player turn, I'll describe how the board will build up. Through the game, players will be taking turn to place their worker tiles out onto the board. As players' worker tiles go onto the board, the gaps will be filled up by jungle tiles. Worker tiles can only go next to jungle tiles, and jungle tiles can only go next to worker tiles. So as these are built up across the board, it will create a checkerboard pattern where you're alternating these worker spaces and these jungle spaces. This is important to keep in mind as you plan how you're placing the tiles out. Each player's turn takes place over 3 phases. The first phase is to place a worker tile from the player's hand of 3 onto the board. The tile must be placed adjacent to 1 or more jungle tiles following the checkerboard rule as described before, and it cannot be placed in what would be a valid checkerboard space, but one where there is no current jungle tiles. When placing the worker tile, the player may rotate the tile into whatever orientation he or she desires. The second phase of a player's turn is to place jungle tiles onto the map. This will only occur if there is a gap between 2 or more worker tiles where a jungle tile would go. So in this case here, there is no such space, and so no jungle tile would be placed out. However, on the next player's turn, if the player placed a worker tile here, there is now a valid jungle tile space adjacent to 2 other worker tile spaces. So the purple player in this phase of the turn would get to choose from one of the 2 face-up jungle tiles in the display and place it into that space. Later in the game, placing a worker tile may produce 2 valid jungle tile spaces. In this case, the white player would take both of the jungle tiles from the face-up display, placing them into each of those spaces. The jungle tile display is not replenished between placements. In the rare occasion where 3 jungle tiles would be placed in the same turn, the third one comes blindly off the top of the pack. The third step of a player's turn is for players to take actions. Players take actions for any worker icons who have just been placed adjacent to a jungle icon, whether that's because the worker was placed or because the jungle was placed. For example, suppose that on this turn, the red player placed this worker tile here, and then placed this jungle tile here. The red player would get to activate all three of these workers, and each worker takes the action of the adjacent jungle space. Additionally, the purple player, during the red player's turn, would get to activate this worker on this jungle space. Players may take the actions in any order they wish. So even though the red player placed this tile and made this pair, before placing this tile and making this pair, the player could take this action first and this action second. But a player has to take all actions in a pair before taking another. So the player could not use one of these workers, then this one, then this one. The player would have to take both actions here before taking this action here. Turn order does not matter when taking these actions because all players' actions are independent of each other, so players can take the action simultaneously. I'll go through what the actions are in the next section of the video. Finally, the player draws back up to 3 worker tiles, and the jungle display is refilled to 2 face-up tiles. If either deck has run out of tiles, no new tiles are drawn. Next, I'll go through the 6 different types of jungle tiles. The first type of tile is the cacao plantations, either a single plantation or a double plantation. For placing a worker tile next to a single plantation, the player gains 1 cacao plant for each worker adjacent to that tile, so in this case 2 cacao plants. Cacao plants are placed on this region of a player's player board. The double plantation space allows a player to take 2 cacao for every 1 worker adjacent. So in this case, the player would again take 2 cacao plants. The space for cacao plants is limited to 5 on a player's player board, and if a player takes a move which would result in more than 5 cacao plants, any excess are lost. The second type of action space is the markets, of which there are 3 subtypes, 2, 3, and 4. A player may go to the market to sell 1 cacao fruit. So placing this worker tile here would allow the player to sell 2 cacao fruits for 2 gold each, taking that gold from the general supply. This space here would allow the cacao fruits to be sold for 3 gold and this one for 4. The player may only sell as many cacao fruits as worker icons who are activated next to it, so in this case the player would only be able to sell 1. If a player comes to this space with no fruits, the action is lost. This tile is the water tile, and when a player places workers next to a water tile, the player advances his or her water meeple as many spaces as there are workers adjacent to that tile. So in this case, the player would advance 2 spaces along the water track. On the outside of the water track shows how much gold the player will gain or lose depending on where they finish on that track. If the player reaches the end of the track, further actions on the water space have no effect. The fourth type of jungle tile are the gold mine spaces. When a player places workers next to a gold mine space, he or she gains the amount of gold shown down the bottom of the mine for each worker adjacent to the tile. So in this case, the player would immediately take 2 gold. The fifth type of jungle tile is the temple. Placing workers next to the temple has no immediate effect. However, at the end of the game, the player who has the most workers next to this temple will gain 6 gold, and the player who has the second most would gain 3 gold. So if, at the end of the game, this particular temple lined up like this, the red player would receive 6 gold as an end of game bonus. The purple player would receive 3. In the event of a tie, the money is shared rounded down. The final type of jungle tile is the Sun Temple. When a player places workers next to a Sun Temple, he or she can take Sun Worship tokens, 1 for each worker adjacent to this tile. Sun Worship tokens are placed on these spaces of a player's player board, and a player may hold no more than 3 at any one time. So, if the player has 3 and takes this action, further workers in that space have no effect. The value of Sun Worship tokens is as follows. Towards the end of the game, it is likely that you'll run out of jungle tiles before you run out of worker tiles. And so, towards the end of the game, placing further worker tiles on the edge of the board may not be that valuable. If you have Sun Worship tokens, you may return one to the bank in order to overbuild one of your existing tiles. That is, to take a worker tile and place it on top of one of your own existing worker tiles. You can then use the workers on the new tile to reactivate all of these spaces. So by overbuilding here, the player would take 3 cacao fruits and would get 2 workers on this temple, giving them the lead on this temple. Note that for the purposes of evaluating temples, only the meeples on top count. This one underneath, who has been overbuilt, no longer counts towards this temple. You can only overbuild your own tiles, and each one may only be overbuilt once. So a subsequent one could not be placed here by returning another Sun token. The game ends once all players have placed all of their worker tiles. At that point, proceed to endgame scoring, which has 3 steps. Firstly, evaluate each of the temples, giving 6 gold to the player with the most workers around it, and 3 gold to second place. There should be 5 temples in a 3 or 4 player game, and 4 in a 2 player game. So focusing on the red player would receive 6 gold for having the most workers around here, and 1 gold for having the equal second most around this temple. Red player does not have any presence on the other temples. Next, look at where the player's water meeple is, and gain or lose the amount of gold shown. So in this case, red would gain 7 gold. Finally, any leftover Sun tokens are cashed in for 1 gold. So note that it is better to use them because you are much more likely to get more than 1 gold out of overbuilding a tile. Leftover cacao fruits are not worth any gold. Players total up their gold, and whoever has the most gold wins. In the event of a tie, most remaining cacao fruits breaks the tie, and if still tied, victory is shared. And that's how to play Cacao. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you enjoy playing. Please subscribe to our channel if you'd like to see more from Meeple University.